Okay, welcome back to everybody for the afternoon session now in the second day of the conference. And this is where you, the delegates, the attendees, get to play a greater role in terms of the workshops that we've got set up for us. So we're going to, in a moment, hear a brief presentation which will act as an introduction into the first workshops, which are going to focus particularly around opportunities for policing research under COVID. As Jeff Pearson and Nairi Wayne were saying earlier this morning, the N8 has been very pleased to have funded research through their small grants, but has also been very pleased to support some of the larger UKRI, that's the UK Research and Innovation funded research that's been going on, and we're going to hear one example of that, a very prominent example of that in a moment. Sandra Walklate and Barry Godfrey from the University of Liverpool will be joining us. But just to say that their contribution will very much act as a feed into a first round of small group discussions. So when this keynote finishes, concludes in 15 minutes time, you will join a discussion group. So you have been pre-assigned even to your discussion group, and you can check your group by viewing your profile in the networking tab or by looking at the message posted in the lobby. And you'll join that group immediately when this session concludes, and that will go on till 2:30. At which time we will have a 15-minute break. You can grab a cup of tea, a cup of coffee, or whatever beverages you enjoy. And then at 2:45, the second and final discussion groups, you will remain in the same groups with the same facilitators, but the focus will shift away from opportunities and challenges of researching policing under COVID towards more general issues about priority setting. As I said, this is very much where your engagement, your contribution, the agendas are reasonably open in that regard. So with nothing further from me with regard to this afternoon's approach, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Sandra Walklate and Barry Godfrey. Sandra is the Eleanor Rathbone Chair of Sociology at the University of Liverpool, and together they have been working, and they're going to tell you much more, on a UKRI funded large project entitled The Shadow Pandemic, but it is much better for them to explain it. So I'm going to hand over first of all to Sandra Walklate.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Adam. I'm very, very pleased to be with you all this afternoon and to tell you a little bit about the project that we've been doing. Perhaps we could put the slides up now. Can people see them already? Yeah, there we go. Okay, thank you. So that's the title of our project. We're focusing on domestic abuse, responding to the shadow pandemic. We were very much moved to put a bid in on this particular topic, partly because it's been an area I've been working in consistently for a while now, and partly because the kind of high profile that was being given to domestic abuse in particular as the first lockdown hit in the UK. So we were very much ready to go to put a bid in. Perhaps I should also make clear that you might know Barry better as a crime historian, but he's also a magistrate. So this project is really about not just looking at the policing response to domestic abuse, but how the criminal justice system itself is dealing with the challenges posed by domestic abuse under the pandemic. So we're trying to actually trace through policing practices through to the CPS, through to the courts. We're going to be talking mostly about policing today, simply because for reasons that I won't go into, we're finding it slightly trickier to get access into the CPS and the courts in terms of access to data. Okay, next slide, please. So really, I've already said a little bit about the focus of our project, and we're really just going to float with you some initial findings, particularly as they relate to those forces in the N8 who participated in our project. But just echoing one or two of the comments that were made earlier, this is not an exclusively an N8 focused project. And I'll go on to explain where our data is coming from in a little more detail shortly. And hopefully we'll provide you with some issues for discussion later. Next slide, please. Okay. I think it's important to situate the policing response to domestic abuse within the general changing nature of the crime context since March. And one of the ways that we've done that is that we've had a questionnaire out with all police forces in England and Wales, and we got 26 responses from 25 different forces. We sent that questionnaire out to domestic abuse leads. We got a few responses from N8 forces. So if there's any of you sitting out there who'd like to talk to us about what you've been doing over the last few months in relation to domestic abuse, it's not too late to join the other 25 who've already shared some of their work with us. And we followed that up with 21 interviews with 21 different domestic abuse leads. And what's interesting about this database is we've got a real nice mix of urban, metropolitan, rural forces, which gives us a nice feel for the complexity of the policing issues out there. So, and also in a sense, the complexity of the crime context, because one of the important things about appreciating policing domestic abuse under lockdown is the way in which it freed up resources. And in freeing up resources gave domestic abuse leads a moment to act as quite in a very positive way, to act as entrepreneurs in terms of their the focus of their particular work. So in that kind of role, people have told us that they used that opportunity to clear the decks of existing cases. So there was a moment in which people's time was freed up to enable them to do that. Some police force areas chose that moment to focus, do some very focused work on repeat offenders or on repeat victims. So for example, if they'd not heard from an address for a couple of weeks, they'd go out and knock on the door and ask if everything was okay. So, you know, I think that's an interesting process. I'm particularly interested by the repeat victims agenda because that's been around for so long, and I'm fascinated by the fact that it's still something that's not necessarily prioritized in the way that it might be. And in terms of actual practices, the shift to the virtual world in lots of ways for things like multi-agency risk assessment conferences and contacting victims, the use of social media and so on, has given a space in which in some areas it's quite clearly improved what they're able to do for victim survivors. Now, I should emphasize that this is a project that's very much in terms of a rapid response research. So we're in the process of going back to forces, of feeding our findings back, getting feedback, and in that kind of iterative way as the project progresses. And Barry's now going to pick up on and talk a little bit more about some of those examples of good practice that would like to highlight, particularly in the context of N8 responses. So next slide, please, and Barry.
Thanks very much, Sandra, and hello everyone from my kitchen. As Sandra says, we were interested really in what was new and innovative in that period when the lockdown came to place, so we were all scrabbling around trying to find a response and to continue some of the duties that are our responsibility in academia and in policing as well. And that led us naturally to look at the digital provision that the police had put in place across all of the forces we were looking at. Innovative perhaps in terms of format, but quite standard in kind of policing message, trying to advertise services and convince people that police forces are still open for business, the business as usual model, and to advertise to the victims and potential victims that there was a place that they could report to and could receive some response. We looked at all of the provision across the N8, as Sandra said, and beyond. Best practice that we found was really the pre-planned questions on Facebook for Q&A sessions. When I say pre-planned, I mean that the questions that were purported to be sent in were actually designed by police forces themselves to cover all of the kind of different needs that victims may have. And that seemed to portray quite a lot of different services and to reach out to different communities. So we thought that that was good, and also some of the links to soap opera stories try and bring home some of the message in a more approachable manner. And actually they were very well accessed by people, had good hit rates. Next slide, please. And again, very traditional physical innovations that were put in place. Adverts, basically, posters on buses, supermarket campaigns, key locations and mobile ad vans to try and reinforce this message that the police are still willing to respond and able to respond to people who are being victimised. The best practice that we identified wasn't actually within the N8, but one force had stationed an officer inside a supermarket. Obviously, during the lockdown, only one person was allowed into the shops and stores at any one time. So it gave people who were worried about the situation they were living in or who had been victimised the chance to talk something through or to report an offence to a police officer who's stationed inside. So this was clearly one of the most effective routes for a direct report in a time when it may have been difficult for victims of domestic violence to access phones or have unsupervised use of a phone or computer to report. So even online reporting had its difficulties when perpetrators and victims were still locked in households together. So we thought this is a very good, when I say we thought this was very good, it's very difficult actually to evaluate what is very good and what works and what didn't work. Perhaps that's something we might return to in the session afterwards in discussion about evaluating some of the schemes. We found a whole plethora of schemes and innovations, but we still are in a position of not knowing which ones were most effective. Next slide, thanks. I think this is probably where the innovations came to the fore in information sharing and coordination. These were, some were victim focused, such as phone calls and visits to high-risk victims and regular victims of domestic abuse. But it was much more aimed towards defendants and back office procedures, I suppose. So many of the police forces visited people on bail or to repeat offenders as a way of reminding them that they were still kept to those bail conditions, but also I think that the police were still keeping up their normal policing duties of protection. The two back office procedures I think were the most interesting of all. First was the increased and enhanced coordination between different parts of the police forces themselves to manage offenders. And because of the court backlog, manage offenders over increasingly long periods of time when they would be still on the books. And although I think I'm quite comfortable, I'm sure Sandra is as well, quite comfortable with the term incapacitation. It wasn't one that the police used, but I put it in those terms of identifying high-risk offenders who may be committing domestic abuse offences, but may also be involved in other criminal offending, and to have increased information sharing coordination across criminal justice and the police to make sure that those offenders were incapacitated in other ways. And also keeping the back office theme, the enhanced partnership arrangements were enhanced through digital provision for online MARECs, which meant that they were able to be held much more regularly, had greater involvement of all of the partners. In fact, most of the police officers that we talked to reported that they had had far greater engagement with their MAREC partners during the lockdown period than they had previously. So the digital there was actually quite useful in keeping up or even enhancing the provision. Next, thanks. And lastly, the hard to reach communities, something which was a particular focus of ours. And again, there was some activity, but it was more about advertising and translating police services into formats that communities could understand and access, rather than tailoring any particular services. So I think Sandra and I both feel much more work to be done there in that area. Next slide, thanks. Okay, I think that's back to Sandra.
Okay, thanks, Barry. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of the focus of the project and some of our initial findings. Our next steps is to actually look in depth at 5 force areas as case studies, and to try and talk to not just the DA leads, but also the criminal justice leads and the chief constables and the police and crime commissioners, all of which are proving different levels of negotiation to try and get access to them. We need to strengthen what we can get out of the CPS, and we need to actually keep pushing the courts to try and get information out around how things are working in terms of the backlog of cases and what that looks like for victim survivors and related services. Already, just echoing back to the comments Adam opened with this morning, already I think you can see, from not necessarily frontline officers, because DA leads aren't necessarily frontline officers, but you can see the range of ideas, the level of industry, the capacity for innovation, and the absolute enthusiasm that these DA leads that we've been talking to have for the work that they do and the commitment to the work they do, and when they have the space and the resources to deliver on that work. And that's kind of interesting, given the rather, perhaps of just a hint of criticism, the bit of absence of a gendered appreciation of the policing task, perhaps so far today, which is, apart from one of the slides from the Police Foundation, that does point to domestic abuse being an increasingly important task that occupies police forces going forward. Whether any of the innovative practices we've begun to talk about stand the test of time, we don't as yet know. Our project goes for another year, so we might have some sense of that by the end of that. But there's also some continuities in here, which the academics in the audience will perhaps know what I'm alluding to here when I talk about justice by geography, the kind of variable nature of access to service and service provision that victim survivors have, the tensions between police crime commissioners' priorities and what police forces might have as priorities, and the need is still out there. It has been for over 30 years for a really holistic and coordinated response to domestic abuse, of which the police are inevitably only one ingredient. Plenty, I hope, for people to pick up on in discussion. Thanks, Adam. I suspect we've gone over a few minutes.
Slightly, yes, but thank you very much. That was very important. Thank you, Barry and Sandra. I'd say just 2 things struck me by your presentation, but also about this particular moment of living under COVID and COVID restrictions. It seems to me, first of all, in terms of kind of opportunities and challenges that creates, that I've been incredibly struck by the openings for new knowledge generation, new research that actually responds to some of the new demands and the changing, although some of it, these are long-standing problems, these are long-standing issues, as your work clearly demonstrates. But the other The other opportunity that you seem to be pointing to there, and maybe we can pick up in the work groups, is also about new opportunities for joint working, new opportunities for collaboration, and new opportunities for sharing data where there might not have existed, courts and CPS maybe aside. Anyway, thank you very much. That's a really useful framing of some of those questions. We're going to break up now into the small discussion groups. I should just say these are being facilitated, both the ones now and the ones later today, facilitated by our partners, Overlap Associates. They will be in charge of ensuring the discussions are productive and useful. They will also be drawing together some of the discussion points, the conclusions from both this round of workshops and the second round of workshops later today in the form of a report. We will be making a public version of that available in due course via the NA website. So with no more ado, apart from to thank Barry and Sandra